Welcome to this lesson. Andre and our staff have combed through our best lectures, speeches, and presentations to bring you today's principle. As you watch these lessons, keep in mind how you might best apply the morals, wisdom, and principles in your ordinary daily activities. We know that what we practice and support with intention, we can improve on. Leadership and diversity advocacy requires that we practice both mentally and in the demonstration of our values. Take this time to reflect on your behaviors, build on your strengths, and minimize your areas of weakness. Remember, we look forward to seeing who you become. Andre and our team at AM Horizons will start you on this journey now.
My name is Andre Cohen. I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure doing these classes, and so one of the things that I wanted to address was this idea of cultural competence. And so I just did a session not long ago, and I wanted to, I didn't necessarily have enough time to hit all the points that I wanted to hit, but I wanted to make sure that these key markers were introduced as concepts that can be helpful when having conversations about multicultural competence or cultural competence, particularly in an organization. And so one of the things that we started off that presentation with was really talking about the nature of culture and why it's important to be able to tie those features of a culture to organizational change and development, right? So those things were extremely important. So I'm going to continue that conversation right now. So we'll start with those as our kind of primary points of understanding. And so one of the things that we talked about was this idea of the carrot of culture, if you will, right? So there is there's the root of the culture, which we will call core values of a culture, and then there are the artifacts of the culture, which are the things that are easy to see from a cultural standpoint. And so when we talk about this idea of these artifacts and these core values, what we understand is that they are a symbiotic relationship. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the artifacts and the core values, and that the artifacts are actually the physical manifestation of those core values.
Did that comment come out wrong? Was that joke meant to be funny? Are you facing disciplinary action for your behavior or language? You might need to be aware. Sensitivitytraining.org has your solution. With our one-on-one coaching, engaging courses, and online diversity assessment tools, we can help you be aware. So when you need sensitivity training, look no further than sensitivitytraining.org. Sensitivitytraining.org, when you need to be aware.
When we start talking about developing either cross-cultural competence or cultural competence within an organization, it's important to recognize the relationship between these two pieces, that artifacts are directly connected to core values, and core values also need artifacts. I don't know if you've gardened, but if you take off this top layer of the carrot, if you take off the stem, if you will, it will be very difficult to locate that particular carrot. And so the same can be said about cultures, that if we take away the artifacts, that somehow the culture may get lost. So those two things are extremely important to recognize. We also want to recognize that in culture, there's this concept of high context and a low context culture. And so high context means that the context is very important in that cultural experience. And so when we talk about artifacts, there's some very specific things that high context cultures look for in terms of their artifacts. At the same time, a low context culture will have different types of artifacts or things that can be seen. And so we'll talk about those as we further develop this conversation around organizational cross-cultural competence. And so when we talk about core or deep values, the same applies, that there are high context core values and low context core values associated with this diagram of the carrot. So that'll be our jumping off point. And so here we have a matrix, if you will. We have a matrix of cultures that we'll spend just a little time talking about. So there's artifacts across this axis, and cultures on this lower piece. And then there's the high context, and then there's low context. So when we talk about artifacts in relationship to a high context culture, we're typically talking about things that relate specifically kind of to our five senses, right? That appeal to our five senses. And so people are extremely important in terms of looking at this high context. Colors, items, symbols, icons, pictures, the way designs are created and whatnot. All these things appeal to our five senses. And in a high context culture, when we talk about artifacts, this is where we start noticing that we have pieces of artwork that represent the clients that we serve, that we start showing in our brochures, people who look very similar to the people who either work in our organization or are being served by our organization. And so that sense of a high context culture becomes important as we explore these kinds of things. In terms of core values of folks interacting with us from this high context culture, it's typically collective in nature. So where, in terms of artifacts, we may show one person of color, but in terms of the core values of the organization, we certainly understand that we need to have more than just that one person of color if we want people to be successful in our organization or as our clients. We know that folks who operate from this high context culture as it relates to these core values are very thoughtful. And what I mean by that is that they typically spend a lot of time or a great deal of time not just thinking about themselves, but thinking about the impact of their behavior or the impact of services on other individuals. And so they're very thoughtful. Interpersonal skills are extremely important, right? So how do we relate? And then trust, this idea of trust is based on two things. It's based on people or relationships, and it's also based on this idea of consensus. So what do groups say about this way of being or about this organization? What's the general consensus of those things? And so when we look at the low context culture as it relates to artifacts, what we see is that low context is about icons, logos, reports, metrics, data, statistics. And so these are things that appeal basically to kind of our logic, right? So that appeal to our logic. So we need data. We need things that can't or be disputed. We need facts and statistics and so forth in terms of these artifacts. And so annual reports become important to folks who are operating with this low context. That becomes important. Well, we also know about low context in terms of core values, that rugged individualism or the individual's contribution to the whole is extremely important and valued. That they are typically emotionally restrained in terms of the core values. And so sometimes when people get heated or emotional, it's oftentimes difficult, or it's a hurdle for people who operate from this low context point of view to interact with that. And that intrapersonal relationships, so as opposed to what is our individual one-on-one relationship, but how do we work across groups becomes important. And trust is built or sustained by policies and organizational development. So I trust the leadership in my organization, whether I have a relationship with them or not. And again, these are generalizations in terms of how to talk about context. So we've addressed what culture is around its artifacts and its core values. We've talked about this high context and low context stuff. Another dimension that I wanted to add to this is the organizational development dimension. So the org development dimension, which when we talk about the individual as it relates to all four of these, we want to talk about the who. A good way to talk about that is to think about that in terms of diversity. So I'm writing the word diversity right here, right? So diversity is looking at the individuals, who's here, who shows up, who's a part of the process. When we start talking about groups of people, we start talking about this idea of equity. And that's the how, right? So diversity is the who when we start talking about the individuals. So what individuals are a part of our system, who's showing up, what's the data and statistics around that stuff. And then we start talking about the how. So equity is looking at, are people getting what they need given our systems in our organization? And then we have the where and the what, which we will call inclusion. We'll call that inclusion. And another way that I like to use these three things, particularly as it relates to these low and high context cultures with the artifacts and values.
Sorry for the interruption. I needed a break. Andre was challenging some of my basic assumptions. While I get myself together, check this out.
This idea of making a cake, right? So diversity is the ingredients, equity is the process of mixing all of those things, and inclusion then becomes the process for the finished product. And so when we start talking about organizational development, these are the scales or benchmarks that we should be looking towards in terms of determining how well we're doing with this idea of cultural competence and cultural inclusion. And so when we look at these context pieces, we have to then ask ourselves in terms of our organization, are we looking at artifacts or what is the purpose of the artifacts that we're demonstrating? I know that there was a university in the Midwest that photoshopped a number of people of color into a scene at a football game. Well, what they were trying to do was create these artifacts. And one of the things that I'd like to kind of remind us is that when artifacts are not connected to core values, they become stereotypes. So when artifacts are not connected to core values, they are stereotypes. A good way to even think about that is to think about Halloween, right? So this is a time where people dress up in stereotypes, not often not understanding, knowing, or even caring about what those icons, those peoples, those symbols represent. Again, artifacts are the physical manifestation of core values. And so when we start looking at our organization and we look at the people who are in our organization, we have to recognize that the people who are there or the people who aren't there are a statement of our core values. When we start looking at our logos, when we look at the things that represent us, our statistics, those are physical manifestations of our core values. And if we're trying to operate cross purposes, this is where we start to see things that are problematic. So if I have I'm trying to get people of color, I'm trying to, I have posters up of folks, but I'm operating from a different core value system, then I'm going to have some difficulties. I'm going to have some conflicts. And this is typically where we start to see organizations not doing so well in terms of having diversity and inclusion as a part of what they do, not engaging their clients or the changing demographics as they'd like, because they're operating from one set of core values and trying to appropriate a different set of artifacts. And so we have to be mindful of those things. Coupled with this idea of looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because if I'm looking for just diversity, there are certain artifacts that I would just pay attention to, or there are just certain individual characteristics that I'll just be looking towards to use. And so the same with equity. So how do we use these things? How do we engage people in a process in our organization? And then inclusion, where and what are these people doing? So where are these people in the organization? What are they doing? How are they included in the organization given this background? All right. And then lastly, I want to kind of move over and talk about this idea of monocultural versus multicultural. And you'll see a bit of glare on my screen, and I apologize for that, but I think you'll get the point in terms of what we're trying to get to. So we have monocultural, which means one culture, and typically that is the dominant culture of your organization. And then we have multicultural, which is getting the voices of the many folks who are in your organization. And so as we move from monocultural to multicultural, what we recognize is that one of the first stages, or early stages of moving to a multicultural organization is that we're monocultural, which means that we're spending a lot of time paying attention to the artifacts. Now remember, we said that artifacts are the physical manifestation of values. And in this particular example, what we recognize is that our values, or the root of our culture or interaction or intervention, is relatively small compared to the artifacts. And so this becomes kind of a cognitive process. And one of two things typically happens as we're on this journey. We're either in denial or defense because we're looking at these artifacts. So we look at the artifacts and we say, well, we have so-and-so people, or we've printed all of our materials in other people's languages. Doesn't that make us multicultural? Or doesn't that make us culturally competent? And that's not necessarily the case, particularly if the artifacts are not connected directly with the appropriate right or mission-driven core values. And so we end up with denial and defense. And denial says that we don't have a problem because we have these artifacts. Defense says, back up off of us because we have these artifacts. And so it's a very cognitive process. And so when we have that cognitive dissonance, oftentimes these are the two places that we go in terms of relating to moving along this continuum. And then we start talking about the effective. And in terms of effective, what we mean is, what is our mode of operation in terms of dealing with this multicultural advancement as we move. And one of the things that happens in this effective stage is that we either minimalize the cultures that we're working with, or we move to some kind of acceptance, which typically looks like a resignation or of dealing with these cultures. And so when I say this idea of minimalization, what we go to is kind of that blind, colorblind place where all people are the same. There's the universal human nature, which is in fact true. However, at the same time, our humanity is very similar, but there are some things that make us remarkably different in terms of how we express that humanity, right? So one of the things we know is that culture in and of itself is adaptation to a context. And so as context change, so does culture. Culture adapts to the context. Now, one of the things that happens with this minimalization is that we go to a place of universality and say it's not that big of a deal because we're all the same. Not bringing into our cognition the fact that some of these the differences or the way that we've seen the world are actually quite profound. Although our humanity is generally same, but how that humanity gets expressed is very different according to our culture and our context. And so acceptance says we understand these differences, and we can I believe we can work with these differences, but this affective state doesn't know exactly what to do with those things. So we oftentimes, in this particular stage of cultural, moving from monocultural to multicultural, in this particular stage, we get analysis by paralysis. And so we have meetings about cultural competence. We have organizational task forces that do some fact finding for us, and so we get to a place where no actual change is able to happen because people don't know or aren't sure what to do. And so that's what happens in this particular stage. And then lastly, we get to stage 3, which is about behavioral change. And as you can see in example 1, the artifacts are very big, but the core values are very small. Here we have kind of a maturing or some maturation happening where there's a balance between the artifacts and the core values. And here we're actually applying those core values in some pretty fundamental and important ways. And so this becomes the two ways that happens is that we become adaptive. And so we take the people who are in our organization, we take the ideas, the thoughts, we take the low context and the high context folks, and we adapt those things into the culture of our organization. And so what that might look like is focus groups, starting to have focus groups, or doing some testing in our organization around our racial equity lenses. It could be as simple as creating paired sharing opportunities where the organization says, hey, we're going to have some listening sessions, and this is the way we'll do those things, and here's some things to consider. And so those adaptive strategies, this means adding to the dominant culture, or adding to, in terms of adaptive, adding to the organization. We don't see where, when we're in stage 1, we see this cognitive process, this denial and defense. We see diversity, we see multicultural opportunities as taking away from what is happening in the organization. Whereas in level 3, we start talking about adaptive strategies. We talk about how do we add these things, or what value gets added by having folks participate at these particular levels. And then we move into this idea of integration. And integration basically is how do we start to use all of the gifts and talents of the people in our organization as well as our clients to best move the mission forward. And so I wanted to make sure that we had some conversations about that to take this to a deeper level in terms of looking at organizational cross-cultural competence. Because when we put all these things together, it becomes very clear that the more that we're able to become adaptive in taking the folks and helping them move, helping them integrate, talking about where they are and what are they doing, right? Helps us move into this integration. What we'll recognize is that If we're looking just for diversity, we're going to be looking just at artifacts. We're just going to be at this cognitive level. If we're looking at equity, we're looking at this kind of affective level. And then when we're looking at inclusion, when we're talking about actually producing the cake, what we know is that we start having adaptive strategies, and we start to integrate people into the system. And so I wanted to offer that as an addendum to that particular workshop, because I think it's important to recognize how we start to do those things. And so when we see artifacts, what we have to understand and recognize, when there are people missing, when there are people who are seen, those are all physical manifestations of core values of the organization or the system that we're working in. And so we then have to ask ourselves, are we showing up? Do we have the artifacts that we want to show up based on our values? And if the answer is no, then we must go back to our values and figure out how do we incorporate those core values so that they demonstrate so the artifacts get demonstrated that we want. Again, artifacts and core values are tightly related. And when you see artifacts, they are a clue to what values that organization or that group has. And so with that, I'm going to leave you with those pieces. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at andrecohen.com, and we look forward to seeing who you become.
So you're saying I can ask this cat any question?
The cat is connected to the computer. You just type in the question, it will read his mind. There the answer comes.
You're the man! I've been looking for this for weeks.
Thinking about the principle. Now that you have viewed today's principle, we would like for you to reflect on those concepts by responding to these questions. Question number 1. What do you believe was the core message in this lesson? Question number 2. What principles were addressed? Question number 3. How might you apply these principles to your life? Question number 4. What might be the impact on others if you use these principles? As you reflect on these questions, write your responses down in your journal. Re-watch these principles and watch your life unfold in amazing ways. At AM Horizons Training Group, we look forward to seeing who you become. Brought to you by amhorizons.com and organizationallift.org. That is amhorizons.com and organizationallift.org.
I just want to say thank you for joining us here at AM Horizons Training Group. If you have any other questions, feel free to email us, and you can reach me at andre@amhorizons.com. Or you can give us a call at 651-998-9376. We look forward to helping you nurture your seeds of change.